Hello, everybody. This is Bill Horton here. Andrew had this idea of perhaps sharing some interesting nature topics and so forth. And I know many of you saw the one on bears that came out in the last email since they're starting to prowl around and mess up trash and all that. But then there was some discussion about what would be some interesting and particularly relevant and fun topics for this early spring. And we thought snakes would be really important, both to enhance some of the fun of hiking and the safety of it, and provide some input and things that might be useful to, little people and youngsters in the valley and that sort of thing. So I'm going to hopefully over the next 4 minutes or so give you some information that is useful and a lot of fun, and will make your time in the valley more enjoyable. So just before we get going too far into this, why do we really want to have snakes around the valley? Obviously, they're really critical parts of the food chain in Lonesome Valley. They are both a food source, they're prey and predator. They're a major value for controlling rodent populations in the valley, particularly our rats and mice and that sort of thing. And most of our big raptors love to eat them. So owls and falcons and hawks and stuff enjoy them. And they're also a major food source for lots of other mammals. And some of the other critical snakes use them for food sources as well. So they're really critical for the food chain. A couple things to remember about these critters. They're cold blooded, so they can only deal with their body temperature by moving around. So they get in the sun, obviously, when they need to warm up, and they go to the shade when it's too hot. So you're going to often see them near the edges of places like roads or power cuts and boulder fields and whatever, where they can easily shift temperature and move in and out of the sun or the shade. We're bringing this up, in the springtime because they're coming out of hibernation or dormancy stages right now when the ground temperatures are hitting around 60 or so. And remember, you're not going to see any newborn snakes in the spring because most of them are egg layers that hatch in August or September. And the few that give live births, the rattlers and the copperheads that we'll talk about a bit, also give live birth in August, September. So you're not going to encounter babies. You'll see juvenile snakes and stuff. And really, we wanted to just concentrate on a couple of the only two venomous snakes that we have in the mountains, and then a couple of what I would call fakes, or sort of harmless lookalikes that you ought to be familiar with. And this way, you can identify these confidently, stay away from them, and not get all worried about a bunch of other snakes that are not even of any concern to you. So we're going to talk about these two in general. So the copperhead, first of all, most of you know this guy, but the main thing about the copperhead, they have a copper tone right here on the top of their head. But look at these dark markings on the body. This is what I call these the saddlebags because they just remind me of saddlebags on a horse. But the copperhead saddlebags are very narrow on the top of their body and wide on the sides of their body. So if you remember, narrow on top, that's the copperhead appearance. These snakes are not aggressive at all. They're prone not to bite you unless you accidentally sat on one or stepped on one or something like that. Hopefully, you won't get close enough to see this, but if you ever did, they have this vertical slit in their pupil because they're nocturnal. So a lot of what they do is in the nighttime. And remember that sometimes you'll see one like this guy down here on the bottom right where there's a big dark spot within each saddlebag. You see these dots here. Again, the saddlebags are narrow on the top of the body, but they have those dark spots and very characteristic, and no other snakes kind of, look like that. So, when you see this kind of thing wandering around in the leaves, you can immediately look at the saddlebags. If you see the copper, then you know what it is. They're not aggressive. They're nocturnal most of the time. They're really active during the nighttime anyways. They're very secretive. They blend into surroundings around leaves and rocks, and they don't bite you almost ever. The bites are very rarely fatal. Most 99% of the time, the bites are just swelling and pain unless you have some kind of crazy allergic response or a super high dose of injection of venom. So it's more the pain of the bite. Now, the rattlesnakes, we do see timber rattlers in the Lonesome Valley area. Several of them are up, up where the climbers are, up on Laurel Knob, but you may run into them in other spots. So again, just to be familiar with what it is, well, they got a kind of a fat body, but they have this what's called as kind of a diamond shape or a chevron shape. You see this kind of a V, sort of sharp edged V in the markings on their body, these cross bandings. Again, they're dark cross bandings. And the main thing to notice here, you see the head of this guy way off to the right over here. They have a big, wide, viper-looking head, fat body, but the tail section gets really dark. Even before you see the rattlers, they've got this dark section on the last quarter of the tail. And obviously, if you can see the rattles on the tail or the pits on their nose area, then that helps. But usually, you can't get close enough to see that. Obviously, unlike the copperheads, these bites can be serious and do require antivenom for treatment. One thing about identifying them, you always want to look for this kind of the diamond or chevron kind of pointed appearance. You see, like here's the kind of chevron thing on this snake. But sometimes the banding is broken or blotchy. It's not a solid band. So like this guy right here, you see the rattles. If you got to look at those, that helps. But you've got the chevron, diamond chevron appearance of the mark, even though it's not a full band on this guy. So look at those dark sections and you can pick it out. But looking at the dark back, the tail third or quarter of the body really helps you identify it. Remember that, here's the guy's head. They have these little pits right here on their face, which are their heat sensors. They can only see for about 20 feet. So they use the pits and vibration sense for locating prey. And they're, again, very shy. You're not going to see these snakes very often, if ever. If they sense you're coming, they're gone. And they're really only going to coil and strike if you get them cornered and they feel threatened. It's important to remember, particularly if you're hiking up around this new cave trail or on the south-facing side of Laurel Knob, their habitat is south-facing boulders and rocks and crevices. So that's where it's warm. They love that area. Interesting thing about these rattlesnakes in general, each snake has a little neighborhood. It's about a half a mile in size. They always stay in that area during their season. If you try to relocate one of these things, they will die. They can't survive outside of their neighborhood. But they do travel up to about 6 or 7 miles to go find their winter den. So we could have potentially a den, here, let's say up in the cave area or Laurel Knob for a snake that spends the rest of their summer messing around down in Panthertown or something like that. And again, they come out of hibernation when the temperature is around 60, 65. So that's it. On the troublesome snakes, there's only 2. And then you remember the narrow saddlebags on the top and the chevron or diamond banding on the rattlesnake, and you got it. Now I want to talk quickly about 3 kind of fakes that you might see, and actually I'm going to mention a 4th one just for fun. This was a picture, I forget, some Lonesome Valley member sent this picture, but this is actually just a garter snake. But you see how the head looks very triangular. Everybody says, oh, it's a poisonous snake. Look at their head. This is not a garter snake, but a lot of snakes like this can flatten their head to look evil, and they can actually suck in air and to blow their body up so they get big and fat to make you think that they're dangerous. And this is nothing more than a defensive fraud. For garter snakes, this checkerboard pattern that you see on their back together with this stripe going down the middle, this is just characteristic garter snake markings. But just remember, there's a lot of snakes that can do this kind of stuff to try to fool you. And again, if it's not a rattler or it's not a copperhead, it's almost for sure not poisonous anywhere in western North Carolina. We have a number of these beautiful things. They're called black rat snakes. They're fairly large, 4 feet or so. Normally, this is what they look like. They're black. You may see them crawling up trees and stuff. They eat mice and stuff. They have this funny kind of kinking shape to their body that they do a lot of times, particularly if they get scared or nervous. If they see you coming, they'll do that. But these black rat snakes can also do like that garter snake and try to act like a bad guy. And what they do is they suck air into their body, and you'll see these markings. All of a sudden, they start looking like they have markings on their back that try to mimic maybe a rattlesnake. But if you look at the back half of their body, the tail, it's solid black back here. And it's narrow. So this is a snake that has sucked a lot of air into its body, and he's trying to act like he's going to strike, but of course he's not. They're completely a fake. The other thing to point out here that's interesting. A lot of little harmless snakes do take their tails and shake them in the leaves to create sort of a rattle sound. Um, so be aware that if you hear something rattling, don't necessarily assume it's a rattlesnake. Chances are it could be, but it's probably not. It's probably some other snake that's trying to scare you away by acting again like a big fake. So just to compare these two images again, up here on the left is a timber rattler. Now maybe you don't get a look at that rattle part, but you can see the markings come all the way to the back of the body. Whereas on this rat snake, the markings sort of stop halfway. This is all snake back in here, all this, because they can only suck in up here where they've got primary airflow. So really, you know, in a black rat snake, you would just see the funny pattern on this upper part of the body, and you can tell it's a fake pretty quickly. Now, the other rat snake that we rarely are going to see is the red rat snake. Usually it's actually a pet that people keep because they're so colorful. If you look at their dark markings on their top, their markings are kind of square shaped, and they're not narrow on the top, they're very wide. See how the copperhead is very narrow over here on the upper right hand image, and this guy is very wide. So you can quickly, if you ever, these are rare to see these guys, you'd be lucky to ever see one in your life, but if you did, you'd know right away it's not a problem. And then the other fake to talk about is the milk snake that we have in the area. They're a large, you know, snake, totally harmless. They're also run around cornfields and stuff. But again, the saddlebag, if you see a dark marking on the top of it, you'll notice it's very wide on the top of their body. It's not narrow like a copperhead. And their markings have these black outlines, these very sharp black outlines that you see. When you compare that to the copperhead markings, you can see that they're totally different. And as long as you've got that in your mind, you're set on that. The last sort of mimic that we have in the valley are water snakes, which we have a number of them hanging around the trout pond, Long Lake and stuff. They're totally harmless. There are no poisonous water snakes in western North Carolina. So you can rest assured if you're running around in the water, copperheads and rattlesnakes don't go swimming in the water and like to do that if they can help it. But again, when these snakes are kind of funny because when they get wet, their markings start to show up. So you might see that marking and think, oh my God, it's a copperhead. But again, the saddlebags are wide on the top instead of narrow. So you know it's not a copperhead, even though it looks kind of suspicious. And they're doing the same thing. You see this kind of square looking head. They're flaring this to look like a bad, evil guy to try to scare you away. And they're sucking in some air, might change their markings a little bit. But there's no poisonous snakes. And these water snakes can either mimic a copperhead if you take a quick look at it, or the other thing is a lot of times if they're dry and they haven't gotten wet, their markings are almost invisible. So somebody might look at that and go, oh my God, it's a water moccasin. We don't have water moccasins in western North Carolina. Now, if that snake jumps in the water and gets wet, this is what you're going to see. But when they're out there lounging in the sun, that's what you might see. So if you saw that hiking, you're lucky you just saw, you know, a water snake, and leave it alone because they're a critical part of the food chain and all that stuff. So there you go. Now, when you're out running around, if you were ever to see one of these narrow saddlebags, you'd know to pay attention. If you saw that diamond marking, you'd know about that. You know that if the saddlebags are wide on the top, that it could be a water snake if it's in the water. If there's a big, long black tail, it's probably a black rat snake, unless the whole snake is usually black anyway. And the milk snakes have this big black line around their saddlebags are wide as well, and the wide saddlebags on the red rat snake. So there you go. Now you don't have to be afraid of any bad guys in the mountains. And just remember in closing that, you know, they really help us with our rodents. They feed all our big, great birds and stuff. If you see a snake, please don't harass it or kill it or poke it. Just leave it alone. And if you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. If you happen to see one that concerns you, just leave it there and talk to Andrew or one of the Lonesome Valley staff for advice or any other action. And remember that timber rattlers in particular are threatened. It's illegal to mess with them or kill them or transfer them in North Carolina, so they need, you know, a wildlife expert or somebody to deal with it if you're going to do that. And that's it. Happy hiking. I hope that information's fun and useful for you. Bye-bye.